So the judge actually granted that. He actually set a date for presenting a defense. And by this time it was, I think, the spring of 2003. I think it was like April or something, 2003. He set a date for, I believe, sometime in December of 2003 for the defense phase of the trial to begin and possibly end. But what happened is the Crown prosecutor really didn't want me presenting a defense because he knew what would happen. He knew that basically, I was just going to show how the law had been misused and abused to conceal clergy abuse and so on, and how Jeremy Searle and Val Burdon and other Montreal Unitarians had cynically misused the criminal justice system in an effort to shut down a peaceful public protest, and he didn't really want that to happen. So what happened is he actually made a motion for an acquittal just a few days later, after the judge had agreed to allow a defense and had set a date for a defense, without my knowledge. I was actually served, well, I wasn't served, but a bailiff did come to my apartment where I was living to serve me with a notice of this court date, but I didn't get that notice because I was moving and I wasn't there when this notice was delivered in April of 2003, if I remember correctly. So I only found the notice later, I think, when I went back to, clear up some loose ends at the apartment that I was moving out of. So that was that. Essentially what had happened is, unbeknownst to me, I was acquitted. And so when it came close to December 2003, I went to the court to just, figure out some of the details and everything. And so I spoke with the clerk about the upcoming trial date. And the clerk said, "Oh, you've been acquitted." And I said, "What?" And so they told me what had happened, what I just related, how I'd been acquitted a few days after the judge had granted the right to present a defense and had set a court date for the defense. So that was the end of the first attempted misuse of Canada's criminal justice system by Montreal Unitarians, but it wasn't the only one. There have been many interventions by SPVM police officers in the interim, and some of those interventions have definitely been abusive, have definitely, police harassment and police intimidation that's clearly trying to dissuade me from protesting, with threats of arrest, even threats of imprisonment, tickets for writing chalk slogans and this kind of thing. So there's been a fair bit of that kind of thing. And then when Reverend Diane Rollert became the new minister of the Unitarian Church of Montreal, I sent her an email saying, you really should talk with me, towards the end of resolving this conflict in a manner that lives up to the claimed principles and purposes of Unitarian Universalism, which include affirming and promoting justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, to say nothing of engaging in a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. And instead of engaging in dialogue with me, as I suggested she should do, Reverend Diane Rollert instead claimed to be very, very frightened of me, and she misconstrued one of my statements about having protest actions held in reserve as being a threat against her, which was absolutely not the case. But she pretended that this was a threat against her safety. And so what she did is she rounded up other church members to sign depositions to the police about how terribly frightened of me that they were, how they feared for their safety and so on, and sought a restraining order against me. And I believe one of the reasons that Reverend Diane Rollert chose this particular stratagem, if I can use that term, was because the burden of proof in terms of obtaining a restraining order against a person is much lower than the burden of bringing criminal charges against a person. You know, you do not have to prove beyond reasonable doubt that the person is a threat against you. The level of proof is considerably lower. But you do have to have reasonable grounds. You do have to have reasonable grounds for your fear for your safety. And as far as I was concerned, neither Reverend Diane Rollert nor anyone else who signed depositions to the police actually had any reasonable grounds to fear that I would, you know, harm their physical safety. I'd never harmed anyone in the past, and I never threatened any harm against members of the Unitarian Church of Montreal, etc. So basically, I contested the restraining order, and it went to hearings, not a trial, but a hearing with a judge. And I unfortunately got one of the worst judges in Quebec presiding over the hearing. This was a political appointee, essentially, who had a reputation for incompetence and just being hard-nosed and so on. You know, when I tell lawyers the name of this particular judge, their eyes roll. So she has this reputation. It's not something I'm making up here. In fact, she's no longer a Quebec court judge, I think, as a result of finally being removed from the bench. So, in any case, whenever I tried to properly cross-examine Reverend Diane Rollert about her claimed fear of me, the judge shut me down. She basically took Reverend Diane Rollert's initial answers, some of which were highly misleading half-truths, if not outright lies, at face value, and I was prevented from questioning Reverend Diane Rollert further to get at the actual truth. So essentially what happened is, after 2 hearing dates spread over a reasonable amount of time, the judge granted the restraining order, which is for a 1-year period. And I had intended to contest that, in other words, go to appeal, but the ruling came down in the middle of the summer, and it seems that most of the lawyers in town were on vacation. I had a hard time finding a lawyer, and you only have 30 days within which you can appeal. And essentially what happened is I wasn't able to find a lawyer to represent me, because I didn't think it'd be a good idea to represent myself in an appeal. In hindsight, maybe I should have. But in any case, in the end, the restraining order went into effect, and I honored it. I basically took a 1-year vacation from protesting outside the church, but essentially what it comes down to is that Reverend Diane Rollert and various other Montreal Unitarians successfully suppressed my charter-guaranteed right to engage in peaceful public protest for a full year by pretending to be very, very frightened of me and writing, depositions to the police, some of which I think can be reasonably described as paranoid fantasies on the part of some of them. So So essentially, you know, my right to engage in peaceful public protest, to do what I'm doing right now, was suppressed for 1 full year as a result of Reverend Diane Rollert misusing the criminal justice system in a cynical misuse of the, you know, system for peace bonds and restraining orders and so on. And in their mind, they thought this was going to be forever. They clearly believed that this would be able to be extended indefinitely. I didn't think that was the case based on my understanding of things, but it was clear from how they behaved, especially when I returned to continue my protest after the restraining order expired, that in the minds of Reverend Diane Rollert and other Montreal Unitarians, that this whole exercise had been intended to be putting a permanent end to my protest, not just a 1-year end to my protest. The Sunday where I came back for the first time after the restraining order expired, I was near the steps of the church, and Reverend Diane Rollert herself, who claimed to be very, very frightened of me and in fear of her personal safety in terms of getting a restraining order, walked out of the church, walked right up to these steps here, and I was standing about here, she was standing about there, so not very far away, and she was essentially alone. You know, she didn't come out with bodyguards or anything, she didn't come out with some hefty Montreal Unitarians, she came out essentially alone, and she said, "You have no right to be here," or something to that effect. You know, basically coming out and saying, "You have no right to be here." Didn't show the slightest fear of me at all, which calls into question whether she was just lying when she claimed to be very, very frightened of me in her deposition to the police. Something that I tried to, you know, show was a very real possibility to the judge, but the judge just wouldn't hear it. The other possibility was that Reverend Diane Rollert actually was very frightened of me, but that her fears were, you know, paranoid delusions essentially, deep, deep personal insecurity, you know, like irrational, unfounded fears. But, you know, based on her behavior after I returned, I think she just plain lied. I think she just